The World Bank Group has announced that it will discontinue its doing business reports because of the irregularities in the 2018 data for China, as well as the 2020 data for Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Azerbaijan. It showed an annual perception index and report that empirically assessed the prevailing business climate conditions across 190 countries by tracking the lifestyle of a small or medium-sized business within a given time frame. Now, for many of us, it's hard to imagine a world without the World Bank Index. Over the past 2 decades, the ranking of how friendly countries were to investors became indispensable to columnists, economists, and emerging market politicians. It served as a catalyst for economic reforms and investor decisions across the globe. Some of the areas the report measured business efficiency included starting a business, dealing with construction permits, getting electricity, paying taxes, enforcing contracts, and more. But the annual report is now dead, following an external investigation of apparent data irregularities in the rankings. The World Bank management has paused the next doing business reports and initiated a series of reviews and audits of the report as well as its methodology. There have long been criticisms of the report. How do differences in cultural and political institutions affect the ease of doing business in different places? Do differences in colonial background still matter? To what extent do reforms undertaken in one country influence its neighbors? And now more questions for doing business across the world without the report. Today, we'll be looking at the World Bank ending the Doing Business report. I'm Tolu Lokpe Adelaru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me from Kigali, Rwanda is Dr. Andrew Mould. He is the Chief Regional Integration and AfCFTA Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa of the UNECA. Andrew, welcome once again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Tolo.
Yeah. All right. Let's start with a bit of background, particularly with the Doing Business report. It's been about 17 years now that this report has been in effect. It has its criticisms, but over the years, it has become quite an influential tool, a very important one that when it comes out, governments are saying, look at what we're doing. They're holding it up as a banner of credibility and reforms. How did it become such an influential tool that an increase or a decrease in the rankings of a country were so closely watched?
I'm very sorry, Tolu. I didn't quite catch the question. Could you just repeat it again, please?
So I said, how did the Doing Business reports become such an influential tool over the past several years?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think there's a global demand, I think, for monitoring investment climate. So this is partly private sector driven and also partly by governments across the world as well, who want to know how they're performing relative to competing countries and other economies in their regions. So, that's one of the reasons. And of course, the World Bank is an institution with a lot of resources, so it's been able to put a lot of money into the Doing Business studies.
All right, so let's quickly get into the issue that has brought about the end of the reports now. So this involves China, Azerbaijan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, the 2018 and the 2020 reports. So briefly take us through what the irregularities in the data mean. What has really happened?
Well, I think there were some accusations about some manipulation in the rankings for some of these countries. And an internal World Bank study, to the World Bank's credit, they were very open in terms of publishing all the results of their own inquiries. The World Bank came to the conclusion that it was no longer tenable to continue with this report. I think some countries will be regretting this decision because a lot of countries have put quite a lot of resources into actually improving their rankings under Doing Business in the past. But the bank has to be applauded at least for taking a stand in this particular case. It's not the first controversy actually that Doing Business has met with. Even in its initial years, there was some controversy around the overall approach that Doing Business took, the legalistic approach and favouring very much the Anglo-Saxon common law approach to legal affairs around business rather than the civil codes of Francophone countries in Africa, for example. So there were some controversies at the beginning, and there was also an earlier controversy surrounding Chile as well in its own rankings. So it's not the first time that the doing business has met with controversy, but this 2020 investigation has led the bank to decide to no longer continue the report.
Yeah, and I will get into what the former chief economist for the World Bank said after he left just a few years ago. But let me ask, does the findings of the investigation now, does it call into question the integrity of all previous reports that the World Bank has released for the doing business report?
Well, I think the issue is actually a wider one. Doing business is a composite index, and it looks across 10 sub-indexes of different elements in the business environments in countries. But I think all reports where you're compiling a lot of different indicators into one single number and ranking have some inherent problems they have to deal with in terms of the weighting of all those different factors. You know, which is most important? Is it getting access to credit for a new business, starting up new businesses? Is it protection of intellectual property? There's all kinds of areas which are looked at in these kind of indexes. The World Economic Forum has a similar global competitiveness index, which is even more comprehensive than the doing business. And I think when you start aggregating things and then coming up with universal rankings, then you start to have problems in terms of defending the way those rankings are compiled. So, you know, I wouldn't single out the World Bank particularly for this issue. A lot of international organizations now have composite indexes of one sort or another to measure different dimensions of development, the business environment, and competitiveness. And I feel that they all have an inherent flaw in the way that they're compiled. You know, the more sub-indices you have, the more complex it becomes to evaluate these sub-indexes in a objective way.
Interesting. So let's get back to some of the criticisms, and we'll go a bit further into that. There have been criticisms that the report has been politicized over the years. We know in this particular instance involving China that there was pressure applied with the head of the IMF, who was then at the World Bank as well. We're also seeing some of that pressure may have been applied by Saudi Arabia. In 2013, the World Bank's own internal watchdog, the Independent Evaluation Group, actually questioned the reliability and objectivity of the index. So people would ask, why is it that it's this particular scandal, it's this particular outcome of this investigation that has now led to the pulling of the plug? There seem to have been instances, you referenced Chile as well, and that was a very critical situation for the World Bank to deal with that report. So why is it this particular situation that has led to pulling the plug?
Well, as I said, you know, it's not the first time that there's been questions surrounding the integrity of the doing business report. As I said, the earlier findings regarding the negative rankings of Chile during the period of the socialist government of Michel Bachelet, that caused quite a bit of controversy a few years back. I think in the light of this new investigation, the fact that the rankings were queried on a number of countries, and the internal bank study found some evidence that this had been the case. So I felt that, I think probably the World Bank's leadership felt that it was time to possibly pull the plug on this. It's strange that it's the case of China, actually, that was insisting so much on their rankings improving in recent years, because actually, I mean, China, of course, has been one of the fastest growing developing countries in history. And its initial rankings in doing business were actually extremely poor. And yet it was attracting an incredible amount of international investment, as well as very high levels of domestic investment. So it does highlight a little bit one of the weaknesses of the doing business study in the sense that, you know, scoring highly in doing business or scoring lowly doesn't necessarily mean a bad economic performance, or vice versa.
All right, so Andrew, before we go for a break, let me ask you if there's any impact that you think the investigation, the external investigation by law firm regarding the reports will have? Do you think there's going to be any impact for the four countries on their business perception? If they were willing to apply pressure because of the ranking, that obviously means it was a very crucial or critical tool that they were willing to use. Or are we just saying that the influence of the reports may just be for countries in the global south?
Sorry, could you just repeat the last phrase of that question, Tolu?
Or do we think that the influence of the report in terms of how critical it is only for countries in the global south?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite capture the end of your question, but I understand the sense. Yes, I mean, I think if the doing business is now going to be discontinued, then there will be a search for comparable indexes and ways of measuring performance. As I said at the beginning, there's a big demand, I think, both by private sector and governments for this kind of ranking. Now, as a professional economist, I have some reservations over this for the reasons I mentioned about the problems of weighting all the different sub-indices, for example, in an objective way. That's a very difficult task in any case. There are comparable indexes, as I mentioned, the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, which measures more tangible items as well, like infrastructure. It actually measures better, perhaps, access to credit than the World Bank Doing Business study. So there are alternatives out there. I think one lesson to take home from all of this is to just have a bit more of a cautious interpretation to rankings in any composite index of this nature. Both governments and the private sector need to be a little bit more cautious about how to interpret rankings, just simply because some of the underlying weaknesses in this kind of methodology.
Okay, Andrew, we're going to go for a break. When we come back, I want to specifically get into the circumstances of what this might mean for African countries. Let's look at what it means for countries such as Nigeria, Rwanda, Kenya, and South Africa. We'll also look at some line of reasoning that says that this has been an index that has outlived its usefulness. We're looking at the World Bank ending the Doing Business report on today's Business Edge. Do stay with us. Dr. Andrew Mode is still with me, my guest today, as we look at the World Bank ending the Doing Business report. And there have been a lot of conversations and criticisms over the years. Andrew, let me ask about this situation in terms of what it means for African countries, countries such as Nigeria, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, that look forward to seeing the ranking every year that the report is released. Should we doubt their own improvements or declines over the past several years? You've mentioned that there are other indexes as well. So where do they now look to sort of give themselves direction when it comes to reforms? Because that's really what a lot of countries were doing with this index. They were allowing it to guide them towards what they can do in terms of the business environment in their countries.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it was very influential, this index, in the case of Rwanda, where I'm currently based. Rwanda, specifically went out in the late around 2009, 2010 to improve its ranking under the Doing Business. They basically asked the bank, what is it we need to do to improve our situation? And they made the appropriate reforms and managed to achieve a very impressive improvement in their rankings. They did suffer a setback a few years ago when there was a change of methodology again in the Doing Business rankings, and they had a setback then, but subsequently adjusted policies so that they could improve again. Now, Rwanda is a particularly interesting case because of that progress in the Doing Business indicator. And yet some economists will question whether there was a strong link between the reaction from investors outside of the country. So Rwanda's been doing quite well in recent years in terms of improving foreign direct investment inflows into the country. But you'd have to say that it came with quite a considerable time lag after improving the rankings. So there was no immediate effect between improving performance under Doing Business and attracting that additional investment. It was the late Malawian economist Tandiko Makandawire, who was like to observe that there was a very poor correlation actually between good performance in doing business and actually attracting foreign direct investment subsequently, which was the purpose for which it's been used by many governments, even though I think the doing business economists working on doing business like to stress that it was really looking at the domestic environment, not specifically to attract foreign investment. So for sub-Saharan Africa on the whole, I think the evidence of a strong correlation between doing well in the doing business rankings and actually attracting investment is actually quite poor. And there was an econometric study a few years ago which found precisely that across the continent that the relationship wasn't very good.
So if we say that, but we've seen countries try to effectively put in reforms in order to do better in the rankings. Even Azerbaijan, that is in the spotlight with this, they reduced the number of procedures and times to obtain a new electrical connection. Saudi Arabia also secured new transaction laws and a new insolvency law because they all wanted to do better. But as you said, the data is also saying that there may not be a direct correlation between doing well in the rankings and actually having genuine improvements in the business environment. So if we look at the past 17 or so years that the Doing Business report has been happening and coming out every year, what good then has it done?
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly focused attention on the necessity to have a general business environment that is welcoming to investment. But as I've said, I have some reservations about, the over-reliance on this particular kind of indicator, and also some of the inherent biases, I think, that Doing Business had in terms of this Anglo-Saxon conception of what a good business environment looks like. It was mostly geared towards, the challenges that small and medium-sized enterprises might face, for example, in registry initially. And if we look at economic development and economic success globally, to be honest with you, I think there's an overemphasis now on the role of SMEs, and we're forgetting about the very, very crucial role that larger companies have in terms of economies of scale, investment in innovation and technology, for example, their dominance of global trade. So I think the whole discourse has been a little bit skewed excessively towards SMEs. Yes, SMEs are important for job creation because they represent the bulk of firms in absolute numbers, for example. But in terms of economic development prospects for countries, it's very important to have those large companies which are investing in innovation and technology, which can have the capacity to reach out to foreign markets in a way that small enterprises struggle with. So providing stable wage labor for their employees. So I think that's one of the outcomes actually of all this, that we've overemphasized maybe the role of SMEs and need to look again at the contributory factors, behind economic success. And that has a lot to do with the effectiveness of large companies.
All right. So the bank has announced they are doing an external review of the Doing Business methodology. They hope to strengthen the product and also its usefulness for stakeholders worldwide, and findings should be coming out sometime later. But what do you think is going to come out of this? Do you think the bank will replace the Doing Business reports eventually, will find a way to rewrite it, to recalibrate it, to reposition it? What happens to this report? Is there a way or a need to even salvage it?
I think this certainly represents a full stop on this report for the time being. Whether it comes back in another manifestation, that's quite possible. I've already expressed my general skepticism about there being too many composite indexes around. Composite indexes tend to work when they're relatively parsimonious. That's to say that they have relatively few indicators in them. The minute you have a lot of subcomponents and sub-indices, there's always going to be a problem about how to objectively weight those different indexes. What is more important for a company, for example? Is it getting credit? Or is it being able to register rapidly? Or is it to have intellectual property well recognized? It's very difficult in an objective way to say which is more important. And I actually prefer to look at outcome indicators rather than input indicators. in the sense that it's better to look at countries, how they're performing in terms of their credit to GDP ratios, investment to GDP, their ability to attract foreign direct investment in strategic sectors. Those kind of indicators, I think, are a lot more useful than actually the input indicators, which inevitably are more subjective. So I would suspect there would be a shift perhaps towards a different kind of indicator going forward. But yes, you're quite right, Tolu, there will be demands, I think, for some kind of continuation in the future of this kind of report, just simply because, you know, the issue of private sector development is so crucial for so many countries.
All right, Dr. Andrew Mould, we'll leave it at that. We'll see what happens in the coming months. There are a lot of people who are not particularly happy. I know Nigeria has said they do not support the decision to actually stop the doing business reports, and that sentiment is shared among a number of African nations. But we'll see what the consequences of this are, because there's also questions as to what the consequences will be for World Bank individuals involved in the irregularities of the data. So we'll look forward to updates on that. Dr. Andrew Mould, thank you for joining me on Business Edge.
You're most welcome. Yeah. Have a good afternoon.
And unfortunately, there are still much more questions that remain for many of us. The question of whether or not the World Bank can continue to be a reliable producer of research and statistics while also massaging diplomatic concerns from its funder members. And then the rest of us, the populace, the people who look forward to digesting these reports and breaking them down. Do we continue to trust multilateral institutions when individual countries can bring pressure to bear on them on the work they produce and also face no sanctions? Again, we started with questions. We did get some answers, but we still have some questions. We'll be looking forward to hearing more from the World Bank as the consequences of this external investigation continue to roll out. You're watching Business Edge. Right before we wrap things up, here are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. NC4 to Watch is up next. And this is NC4 to Watch. Here's some stories we have our eyes on. A new report released by the United Nations Development Program, as well as Nigeria's National Bureau of Statistics, says that 20% of the full-time workforce in Nigeria lost their jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The report, which assesses the impact of COVID-19 on business enterprises in the country, is based on in-depth interviews with almost 3,000 businesses from both the formal and informal sectors across major industries of the economy. Second on the list, the Somali Ministry of Commerce and Industry has launched its trade information portal, calling it a one-stop center for accessibility to international trade-related information. Officially launched in the capital, Mogadishu, the portal makes the country the sixth to establish such a portal in the East Africa region. And staying in that region, Kenya's treasury has been borrowing at an average of 3.3 billion Kenyan shillings per day in the first 2 months of the current fiscal year, raising the total debt load by 200.3 billion Kenyan shillings between July and August. The increased borrowing appetite comes even as the IMF, in a new report, classified Kenya among countries with a high risk of debt default. The international lender first downgraded Kenya's ability to absorb more debt in May last year by elevating the country's likelihood of defaulting on its external loans from moderate to high, as well as raising Nairobi's overall risk of debt distress. And finally, the Ithakini municipality in Durban, South Africa, is throwing its weight behind the growth and recovery of the informal sector in the city following the recent riots and unrest. It will host the Informal Traders in Daba on September 22nd. It announced that it would be hosting the Special Business in Daba to unlock job opportunities and promote economic growth within the informal sector. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. And of course, head to our YouTube channel if you've missed any of our conversations, and you can subscribe. Download our mobile app as well and take us with you wherever you go. I'm Tolu Lope Adeleru Balogun. I'll see you again soon.